Okay, just streaming the class. Okay, welcome to a special Tanya class, three-part series. It's the chapters that we are up to in this the magnum opus of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya. Just close the door. Chapter 36 is very famous as it goes off on a little bit of a tangent to explain the purpose of the world according to Jewish mysticism and the mechanics of how humanity, by doing mitzvahs, we bring that ultimate purpose to fruition. But that will be in chapter 37, and that will probably take 2 classes. But tonight, we're going to talk about chapter 36, and I'm going to pull, for those of you that I sent an earlier, I sent you a link earlier, pull it up. I'm going to pull it up here as well to share it, and we will share it on the screen. I want to say that in general, I send the chapter of Tanya out to read in advance. Not that you have to, but it always helps. And usually we use a text called Lessons in Tanya. It's one of the first English translations, annotations. And tonight happens to be, this is such a famous chapter of the Tanya that one of the great modern Chabad scholars, Tzvi Freeman, former hippie, revolutionary turned Chabad rabbi, very intelligent in Jewish mysticism. And I was actually listening just last night to his podcast where he talks about history according to Kabbalah. Fascinating. But he started a project where he worked on a few chapters he didn't finish, Tanya in plain English, which is really cool because he sort of wrote it a little bit, not too different, not too much away from the translation, but enough that it's more speakable English. So this is what's on page chapter 36. I will also put it in the chat box. If I can get to the chat box. Eventually I'll get to the chat box. Okay. You have it on the screen. So I just want to give a little bit of a background. This is a unique chapter. It talks about the purpose of the world, the ultimate purpose, why God created this incredible universe and the cosmos and us. So it's obviously a very special chapter. However, I want to just point out that the Tanya starts off with its nickname or its interchangeable title. It's actually real official name is called the Book of the Intermediate Man, the Book of the Beinoni. Beinoni means the intermediate person, meaning as opposed to the spiritual elite, the tzaddik, the righteous, those that are simply on a spiritual level of awe and love, ecstatic, and so on. That is not the average person, obviously. 99.9% of us are in the spectrum of Beinoni, of a regular person. And he gives a whole prescription, the first 12 chapters, and then chapter 16, 15, 16, 17. And then he goes, he gives another prescription of how, in spite of the fact that we have a very healthy animal soul, meaning we have temptation that's built into our psyche that wants to get us to do the wrong thing. Again, it doesn't have to be, like stealing. It can be much more innocuous, like, self-preservation, selfishness. That's also for the animal soul. It's about the drive of preservation. But we have that as built into our survival psyche. How can we ever hope to live a life where we are in tune with God's purpose for us? I mean, really live lives of integrity. And the Torah says this is possible. As a matter of fact, the Tanya said, just a quick refresher, it said in the title page, the whole Tanya, 53 chapters, is based on one verse of the Torah in Deuteronomy. What's the verse? Ki karov elacha hadavar ma'od b'ficha b'vavcha lasoso. For this matter, it says Moshe is telling the Jews, this matter, keeping the Torah, the mitzvahs, living a life of not just doing it dryly, but have feeling in it, in your speech, in your mindset, in your thoughts, and in your action. It's doable, it's expected. And he says, I'm come to tell you a long way and a short way of how to do it, in spite of the fact that it seems to be counter to our selfish animal soul drive. And that was the earlier classes, which many of them are on YouTube, if you want to look back on our Chabad Pittsburgh channel. In chapter 35, so he gave till 34, chapter 34, we got various spiritual regimens or techniques or prescriptions of how, practical ways to live a life of spiritual integrity in spite of our handicap. And he points out you will always have that quote unquote handicap. I mean, we're calling it quote unquote because that's initial. You have an animal soul that's trying to get you to veer away from God's purpose. That's just, it's inherently the way it is. Notwithstanding that, you can overcome and you can live a life of integrity despite the fact the voices are telling you, go astray, forget it, go pop in, that tub of ice cream and so on. That's through chapter 34. 35, which we did last time, raises an existential question of the Beinoni, of, again, the average man, the average person. Okay, you told me that I have an animal soul and I'm never going to get rid of it. It's always going to be there. I can work on it. I can tame it to some degree, but it's never going to be that I'm an easy street, that I'm naturally always going to do the right thing, the unselfish thing. We're not just mean living a life of cultural Judaism. We mean our Torah mitzvah, and cultural, Torah mitzvahs. We talk about always going out of yourself, and that takes a lot of intent, kavanah. So you're always going to be challenged, but you have techniques to overcome. Well, the Beinoni has an existential problem. Like, this is a really bad deal. Why can't I be like the 0.1%, the tzaddik, the spiritual elite that does not have the animal soul like the average person, is much more neutralized. And he lives, the tzaddik, he or she lives a life of spiritual connectivity and is not tempted to veer astray. As we say in Tanya, in Kabbalah, the tzaddik's challenge is not between good and bad, it's between good, better, and much better, because it does no desire to do bad. And the Beinoni, the 99.9% of us, says, wait a second, that's a really bad deal. Why does God make some people, most people, struggle their entire life? I mean, granted, you can change your struggles. When you're a toddler, you grab candy. When you're a teenager, you try to take the car out without permission. When you're in college, so on. And you obviously mature in your desires and your temptations, but it doesn't change the general concept that it's about me and selfishness. It could be much more, much more adel, much more refined, but it doesn't change the fact that's built in. Beinoni wonders, why am I going to have a handicap my entire life, a spiritual handicap? So chapter 35, which I'm just going to say very briefly, says, you should know that actually, in a way, the Beinoni achieves the purpose of God's intent more, in a way, than the tzaddik, and the one who just is feeling spiritual connectivity all the time and is doing good and better. It brings a parable from the Kabbalah about the Yanuka. The Yanuka was a child spiritual oracle. I don't know a better word. It was a child that was like, spiritually precocious, and she was like knew, questions on a very high level, spiritual questions. And the Yanuka, the child, the Jewish child oracle. I mean, every Jewish mother thinks their child is an oracle, but this was a real one. The Jewish child oracle said, "Be careful of that your eyes." It says that King Solomon said, "Your eyes should be upon your head." Like, your eyes should be in your head. Like, where else should your eyes be? So he said, no, it means your eyes should be cognizant of what's upon your head. What is that? The divine presence. And he says it's a parable. The body is like a wick. The divine presence, in Hebrew, the Shekhinah, God's immanent presence, is revealed, albeit maybe invisibly or spiritually, on us, on our head. I mean, not our head literally, but our aura, when we put oil to the wick and so the flame can burn. What is the oil? The oil is Torah and mitzvahs. And he points out that even someone who's a very spiritual person, meaning that they don't, nothing spiritual in a modern sense, someone who's simply doesn't have a evil inclination. At the end of the day, as much as they love and have awe of God and they only do what's right, they cannot get out of the fact that they are a entity other than God. They're an entity that loves God. They're an entity that has awe of God. They're an entity that only lives to do God's will, but it's an entity. And isn't the whole purpose of Judaism, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad? Hear, Israel, God is our God, God is one, meaning we're supposed to reveal God's oneness. We'll talk about that in a minute. Just by being a body, even with a soul, with our soul, even the soul has an inherent limitation that it is a spiritual entity. It is not one with God. It's God's, errand boy or God's lover or God's servant, but it's not one with God. And that's a certain flaw. However, when we put oil on our body, on the wick, we actually help the body with the soul in it become one with God, because through the vehicle of Torah and mitzvahs, which are one with God. We spoke earlier that the Torah is God's wisdom, intellect, formatted that we can have some relevance to it, but it's even, whatever we know in Torah is actually a layer of a deeper and yet a more infinite level of God's wisdom. The Torah is God's wisdom. It's God's thinking process. And mitzvahs are God's limbs, they're called, meaning they're like a vehicle for God's will, like the hand, does the will of the person. And when you sort of do Torah mitzvahs, for that time, you are nullified or you're consumed in the oneness of God's either intellect or actions, or God's will, the mitzvahs. That was chapter 35. And that was supposed to be a little bit the beginning of a consolation. Hey, Beinani, don't worry, you're not so bad. You have actually, because of your handicap, you're forced to focus on doing God's will or thinking God's wisdom, which while you do that or prepare for that, you're actually becoming a higher level than the tzaddik. You're becoming one, part of God's oneness. That was chapter 35. Now we'll go back to sharing the screen. Any questions on that before I continue? Okay. We're going to read this together. So the glossary. Havaya. I take a lot of these words for granted, having learned Tanya for a while. Havaya, we never pronounce the four-letter name of God as it is written. So we say not Yud, Hey, Vav and Hey, we jumble the words, so it's Havaya, so it's not God's name. You know, like the witnesses, they say God's name. We can't do that. That's profane. That's profanity. So we just refer to God in a Havaya, means God's. It's one of the names of God, and it reflects a certain. It reflects a certain. Whatchamacallit? Transcendent presence of God. Elokim is Hashem hu Elokim or Elohim, but we try not to pronounce, so we put a K versus the H. Elokim is a name of God that represents God's power, might, as is found in nature, in hiddenness. And for those that have learned this, been part of our class, you will recognize the word klipot. Literally, klipot means shells or husks, like on top of a nut, a shell, or that. And a klipa, but in Kabbalah, it says that the negative energy of the world, God creates a veil of obscurity, meaning everything comes from God, good and bad. But the bad is not, well, how could God do bad? Why would God do bad? We'll get to that. But how does God do bad? He hides goodness in an obscure veil called the klipa, the shell. And it looks to us as very bad. Or it is temporarily very bad. And then there's klipat noga. It refers to a translucent shell. So there's klipa like pig. The energy of the pig comes from the klipa, the three impure klipas, meaning irredeemable. It's just in this lifetime, till Mashiach comes, that is an energy that of the pig is for a Jew. We're not talking about using it for football or whatever, for permissible. He's talking about eating for a Jew. That is a energy that is irredeemable, and we stay away from it because it comes from a klipa, a shell that hides the kernel of good to the point that we can't actually sublimate it by engagement. But then there's everything else in the world that is not impure or non-kosher, is klipat no. It comes from an energy, a veil of obscurity that's translucent, meaning it's a veil, it's covering, it's not holy, because holy is something that there's no veil, it's part of God's oneness. But a klipa noga is like in the middle, it's translucent, meaning you're seeing there's a layer, and you can either direct it to take the kernel of truth and use it for a mitzvah or kosher food, for example, a cow, if you slaughter it according to the mitzvah and you eat it for, with intent to use it for energy, then you took the cow, which comes from the energy, a permissible item that comes from the energy called klipat noga, but it's translucent, so you can divert it through intent and activity and mitzvahs to a service of good. Okay, having said the glossary, let's go on. In a follow-up to chapter 35, we said, hey, don't worry, it's not so bad to have a handicap of being a Beinoni. Let's talk about the purpose of creation. The sages in the Midrash, they say the purpose behind creation of this world is God's desire to dwell in the lowest realms. Quote, end quote. God had a desire to dwell in the lowest realms. I want to just circle that, just so you know what I'm talking about. God had a desire to dwell in the lowest realms. So let's think about it before we go on. What does it mean God had a desire? Why didn't it say God had a plan? God had a reason. The reason, does it call it the reason? It calls the desire of the creation of this world was a desire to dwell in the lowest realms. So, we'll talk about desire soon. Let's talk about what does it mean God made a world, and he had a lowest world, and he desired to dwell in this lowest world. So first of all, what does it mean lowest world? it's taken for granted that, that we have some background knowledge that in Kabbalah or in Jewish philosophy, we don't believe this physical world is the entirety of reality. This is a physical world, but on a deeper plane, there's a spiritual world. And on a deeper plane, there's even more spiritual world. And on a higher, we call it higher plane, there's a, not higher as in outer space, but in a deeper, conceptually higher world. And there's a higher world and a higher world. What does it mean lowest and higher? So it's as if God existed in some higher realm, then we could say that some worlds are higher because they're closer to him, meaning and others are lower because they are further from him. But God is everywhere. God doesn't need, doesn't need an adapter. Doesn't need a 220 volt or a 110 volt adapter. God is equal in any situation, in heaven or in earth. So here's the explanation. I'm going to paraphrase. Before the world was created, there was only him alone in perfect oneness, right? We believe that creation had a beginning point when God started. They even say the Bing Bing fits somewhat well with that idea. I can't say that's the end of my knowledge with that. But I've heard that quoted by many knowledgeable scientists. Anyways, there was only he before that, there was just him alone, meaning God's infinite everywhere. There's no room for anything else. And his oneness is everywhere. Even in the void of what's called the area, eventually where he conceptually made a world, meaning he was there also. And it points out that from God's perspective, that is true now. Meaning, just because God created a world, you think God's like no longer in the bathroom? God's no longer in this Sharpie? God's everywhere. God's animating everything. But the change was only in the consciousness of the beings that receive his vitality and light. For now, they receive it through the medium of many filters that conceal and obstruct that light. As far as he is concerned, nothing has changed. In other words, when you see a Sharpie, you're seeing God hidden in many, many layers from God's oneness till you get a material that becomes a autonomous entity that seems totally independent of any creator. I mean, let's think of the minerals that the plastic came from. So that is the interpretation of the verse. It says, when Moses wanted to see God, he said, you can't see me face to face, for no man may see me and live. What does that mean? A lot of things in the Torah are alluding to Kabbalistic ideas. If a human being could see the infinite light, we would of necessity cease to exist. For our existence is contingent on concealment of God's presence. Meaning, if we would see how this pen is really part of God's oneness and has no really identity other than being part of God's oneness, we would not see a pen. It's only through God hiding and hiding, so many layers, spiritual concealments, till you get to a totally obscure reality of the physical reality that seems like, although you can see the world alludes to a higher power, but that takes a lot of, thought and analysis. Apparently, on an apparent level, the world seems autonomous. We know logically there must be a creator, but the way the world is created specifically in a way that you can't see God's presence, and that because otherwise it couldn't exist. But as far as God is, so our teachers, may their memory be a blessing, went even further interpreted that even the angels, who are called living beings, meaning angels are spiritual minds, so to speak. They're spiritual, not physical, but spiritual minds that can appreciate God's greatness. But they are not, they also see God at a much veiled level. It's not as veiled as our veil, but it's veiled. The world of angels, the various worlds of angels, they see they are an entity, Meaning there's a filter that's making them feel independent, albeit much more closer to God than the way we do. And this is what is meant by lowest realms. Again, God, the Medrash says, the purpose, the sages say, why did God create the world? He does not just the world. Why did he create the cosmos? Meaning, why did he create the whole infrastructure from a starting point of his oneness everywhere till it became a spiritual dimension, and ultimately a physical dimension? Why did God do this? For he desired to have a dwelling place in the lowest realms. That this world, it's kind of funny. So let's break it down. There is spiritual worlds, meaning worlds that, again, they're an entity, but they are angels or they're souls, and they're by definition have in Hebrew called tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is a veil, but the tzimtzum, the veil is much less. You can make your brightness on your screen. You can make it black. You can make it, various shades of light. There's much more light there. Those are the higher worlds. It's a spectrum, but let's call it the higher worlds. And then finally, of the lowest world, the world of the physical existence, that's totally obscure, that it's the brightness on the screen is put to totally obscure. You can't see a source. You can't see your creator. It's not obvious. It's not as self-evident. I mean, it's logically evident, but it's not naturally, easily evident. And yet, which would you say if you were God? There's a book called If You Were God. If you were God, what would be your purpose? Which worlds, let's say world though, higher world, spiritual world, or physical world, what would be your ultimate purpose? Let's take a poll. Who thinks higher worlds? Anybody? Okay. Who thinks lower worlds? Thumb up, raise your hand. Oh, I put in the chat. Lower world. But why? Isn't that counterintuitive? Why would God desire to have a world where his presence is barely felt, or very difficult, with much difficulty felt? So we can say, the Hollywood ending, the Hollywood approach. Yeah, God wants the lowest, the physical world, us schlubs here trying our best. But why? What's to be gained? There's no spiritual bliss. In the spiritual world, there's spiritual bliss. As a matter of fact, this idea the question of why did God create the world is not just in Tanya, in the one quote that Tanya brings. It's dealt with in various places. In other places, in Kabbalah, in the Zohar, it says God created the worlds. Meaning, when we say worlds, we mean higher and lower, in order that God should be known. Meaning, if God is no other entity, then how will God's greatness be known? Another way of putting it is God wanted his potential infinity to be actualized. And hence he created an infrastructure of many worlds, ultimately ending in a physical world. But as the descendant of Rabbi Shner Zalman, one of the Rebbes that was a descendant of his, Rabbi Shalom Dober, said, yet if that was the purpose, that God should be known, we don't need a physical world for that. On the contrary, if it's for God to be known, or for his potential greatness to be actualized and shown to entities, you can have a world of angels. You don't need a physical world. Because the world of angels actually does a much better job of recognizing God's oneness. We barely get a glimpse here or there. And for every success, there's many failures to glimpse and live with a consciousness of God's oneness. So if that's the reason to God to be known, he could have stopped after creating spiritual worlds and then have to turn the brightness down to totally obscure and make a world that feels autonomous, like our physical world. Therefore, the reason the Alter Rebbe, the Rabbi Shner Zalman, says he picks the Midrash, is saying the most logical reason is that God had a desire to create the world, the lowest, to be at home. This is the literal. God desired to have a dwelling place, an apartment. Dira in Hebrew is an apartment. Have a dwelling place in the lowest realm. Let's start with the word desire. It makes no sense. And that's fine, because God usually doesn't have to make sense to us. On the contrary, any reason we're going to give to God is obviously not the full scope, because God is infinite, beyond our reasons. So therefore, the Midrash very cleverly used the word God desired. A desire does not have to be rational. We know from the act of creation, both just creation in our experience and through the revelation of the Torah, that God desired to have this world as being the ultimate purpose, where he should be felt, where he should be at home. Let's go back to the chapter. Yeah, that's very nice and inspirational, but why? Meaning, if God doesn't have a reason, right? There's no real reason why God does anything. He just does it, and he chooses for whatever desire. Then why did God choose the lowest world to be that, through us trying our best to do mitzvahs, make him a home here? He could have chosen the higher worlds. Why does the lower worlds have an advantage? I would like you to think about that for a second before I give the answer, because I think it's important to appreciate the question. Okay, you're saying God didn't have any logic, because God doesn't have logic. God had a desire and created many worlds, higher, many, spectrum higher, ultimately in the lowest world, physical world of obscurity. And he chose the lowest world as being the main purpose of the whole plan, the whole architect, the whole blueprint. Why? Why didn't he pick the higher worlds? Anybody like to share their thoughts? Okay, I guess I'll go on. The answer is, this world, its lowliness is true. We don't feel God easily. It takes hard work to connect, to feel, to make God a home in our life. But there's some advantages of this lowest world. Let's read on. Let's talk about the disadvantages of the higher worlds. The higher worlds, they're great, they're super spiritual, and the angels bask in God's oneness. But isn't that a descent of God's greatness? Meaning, so let's compare our world to a kindergarten level, and the world of angels to a postdoc level. And the brilliant Einstein professor is teaching his wisdom, and his wisdom is beyond explanation. But he gives some of his wisdom, albeit lesser intensity, to the postdoc students, PhD students. And then he distills his wisdom to much, much less, till he can give at least a nugget, a soundbite to the kindergarten class, let's say. I don't know if that's a good parable. But at the end of the day, even giving us the brilliant professor, one in a millennium professor, his wisdom is beyond what he gives the PhD students. Meaning, it's great, they appreciate more of it as much as possible, but it's very limited by definition. The angels, the world of spiritual angels consciousness, they appreciate God, hallelujah, but it's limited by definition. It's a descent. It's not the true profundity of God's intensity, because that's God alone. No man can see me alone. Man, meaning even the angels can't see God and survive. However, our world, let's call it um, the world of the illiterate 3-year-old. Obviously, the goal of the brilliant professor is not to teach his wisdom to the illiterate 3-year-old, but something else the brilliant professor wants from the illiterate 4-year-old, whatever. And that is to strive higher. So let me take that parable away. The higher worlds are inherently lower than God's infinity. The lowest world, the physical world, we know we're not getting God's wisdom. We're blind. Or it's very hard. We barely get anything. But at the same time, we have a mission in this world to transform the dark to light. Meaning we have the advantage of growth, of making from our darkness the advantage of light that emerges from darkness. Because our handicap is part of our solution. Our handicap is we don't see godliness. We are living in blindness. We're in a dungeon. So what are we supposed to do here? Our job is to give God something more than the higher worlds, and that is with free choice to take the starting point of darkness and through mitzvahs bring them closer to God, bring this world. Meaning this world is not static. The world of angels and spirituality is static. It's very nice, but it's static. Whatever level it is, that's what it is. Our world, because everything is so hidden, that's our job, is to overcome the darkness and grow. A human being is called a mover in Kabbalah. A mahalech. An angel is called a stationary, static. A human being has mobility, upward mobility. Because why? Your problem is actually your mission. Your handicap, your difficulty of not feeling close to God, and still you try to take this world and bring it closer or overcome the darkness of life sometimes through doing mitzvahs, as we said, putting some oil in the body, in the wick to light it up. That is something that can only be done in the physical world. Meaning because we have darkness, we have a mission to overcome darkness, and no other world has that. Now, it must be this goal, but even though it's very beautiful and has a certain inspirational ring to it, it must be this goal does not arise out of any need or to profit. Again, we can't say God needed light from darkness. It simply was his decision that he would have pleasure within the sense of otherness. The veil is the klipa, the veil of obscurity, is suppressed, and darkness transformed into light. When the light of Havaya, meaning we said the infinite light of God, shines in the place of darkness and otherness throughout all the world, shining with greater intensity and greater power, with the advantage of light that comes from darkness. Then the mere reflection that exists in the PhD angel world. For those higher worlds, it must shine through filters and obstructions to negate and conceal the light, so those worlds do not dissolve to reality. Our world is capable of sustaining this light. God's infinite light somehow can be in the lowest world because God has given us the Torah. So we spoke what was the reason God desired to have a dwelling place in the whole world? Meaning God desired that we should make light from darkness. But wait a second, if we reveal God, don't we cease to exist? Good question. And that's why God gave us the Torah. The Torah is like a special special clothes that we put on as we go to outer space. It's like an astronaut. It's like a spacesuit. We put the Torah we're at the same time getting God's oneness, but we're also able to exist in that oneness. Why is that? How does it work? We'll speak more next week, the mechanics of how mitzvahs transform the darkness to light. But it does reference it here that the Torah okay, we'll talk. Why does the Torah allow you to reveal infinite light yet still stay in existence? So does job one, darkness into light, but two, it allows you to survive as an entity. So it says here, here's how it works. Torah is God's will. God said the 10 statements, 10 commandments. The 10 commandments were sort of the top 10 list, or the main structure of ultimately the 613. And bottom line is God revealed to us and on behalf of humanity God's will and presence through the Torah. I'm going to paraphrase my own words. Torah, it says in the bottom, is also called strength. Why? The Torah is called Oz, our strength. Why is it our strength? For this particular reason, that it allows us to reveal infinite God's presence, the infinite light into the darkness, but it's strength that allows us to continue to exist even in that intensity, in the face of that intense revelation. Why does Torah do that? So I'll give you a quick summary of how it works. As I mentioned before, Torah is not like any other creation. Every other creation in the world is God's, God hides his presence in order to make creation, a Sharpie or a mug or an apple or even an angel. It's all, a filter of God's oneness that something can feel separate at various levels. Torah is not a creation. Torah is God's will. So like everything else is God's creation, meaning it's God hiding himself within it. But the Torah is an expression of God. It's an extension of God. So you either want to call it God's wisdom or God's will, or both. And the Torah, the study of it is the wisdom. It's like when you study the blueprints of a most famous architect in the world, you appreciate their wisdom. You actually get close to them. You can appreciate their crown achievement, this castle they make, and you study the blueprints. You really, not just the blueprints, they are in the blueprint. They're found there that was their crown achievement. They're found in their accomplishments, the architect. Well, God said God created the world as an architect, and he looked in the blueprint, the Torah. The Torah was God's ultimate game plan for reality, and he created a world to enable that game plan. So when we study Torah also, it's God's wisdom, and we do mitzvahs, God's will, but it's put in a special format that it's meant for human beings. So we give charity, it's 10 cents to the pushka, the charity box, but there's a lot of profundity going on there. God made in a way that we can physically do it as well. When we study some of the Torah, the book of Genesis, it's, a story of creation, Adam and Eve, and so on. So it's made in a human, understandable format or doable format, but it's really, that's an outer layer of what it really is God's will and intellect. So the bottom line is God desired to dwell in place in the lower world, meaning he desired to have light from darkness. How do we do that? Well, number one, let's try to not give into the darkness. Let's not get, sucked into it. Number two, he gave us tools called Torah that helps us bring light into the world. And next week, we'll talk much more of the logical mechanics of mitzvahs, how they do that. But suffice it for now, the mitzvahs in the Torah They bring light out of the darkness, and they also shield us from the intensity of God's presence that's in the light that we're bringing, that we can still exist. And it points out that is what the Messianic era is. The Messianic era, Mashiach, is really a time when, it quotes here, where is it? The Messianic era, and especially once the dead are resurrected, a later era of the Messianic era, is a state in which the world has achieved its purpose. Yet the world, meaning that will be when we'll see, sorry for my sloppy annotating, we'll see how the world, we'll be a physical world, but we'll see God in the world. It'll be like, you see, same way, it'll be obvious that there's a creator or a energy behind reality. But you'll still have reality. Okay, I'm going to get to the do in a second. Yet he points out, so that's just in short, Mashiach is this ultimate purpose coming to fruition when the world's darkness is now removed and all we see is the light that we as people have brought into the world for thousands of years through our mitzvahs. He points out in the chapter, but in a minor way, we had a messianic revelation where the world felt one to God, or it revealed God. That was by the giving of the Torah. So in the giving of the Torah, we saw that Havaya is Elikim. We saw that nature was really just a expression of God's infinity, infinite light. And there's nothing else besides him. We saw that by Mount Sinai. We also, the rabbis state, they stared towards the east and heard the verse. Every direction, they heard God saying the Ten Commandments, meaning time and space was literally revealing God's presence, the Ten Commandments, through the Ten Commandments. But the problem was the world wasn't yet worked over like we're doing for the past thousands of years, and therefore it couldn't contain it. It was not able to contain God's infinite presence that was being done alongside or through the Ten Commandments. So therefore it says that the rabbis and the Talmud said at each utterance, whenever God said a commandment, their souls flew out of their bodies. They couldn't contain it. They couldn't, right? You can't, Raiders of the Lost Ark, give a crass example. You can't see God's presence survive. But God wanted them to survive. So God revived them with the spiritual dew of what we call the dew of the Messianic era, of the time of which God will revive the dead in the future. But meaning the dew is a term used for the Messianic era, meaning it's the dew of Torah. Torah is called dew. It's called many names. One of them is called dew. It's the nourishing energy of dew. But it refers in this context of that it helps. God gave them revelation and then gave them the dew to revive them, the Torah to revive them, meaning that they could take revelation and not, pass out or be consumed in it. So that's that. And then it says, once they did the golden calf, the world got coarsened very much so. And now we are carrying on of taking the Torah, bringing light from the darkness, and also at the same time fortifying ourselves in all of this reality to exist as it will eventually, even when Mashiach comes, and you will see the source of reality is Havaya, God's infinite light. And the point is that, and this actually is not just for the Jewish people, the light will shine to Israel through the Torah, which is called strength. From the extra intensity, see where I'm just annotate some more. It's got to be a better. Let's see this little thing. But here, the light will shine to Israel through the Torah, which is called strength, meaning the extra intensity of light that will shine to Israel, the darkness of the nations will be illuminated as well, as is written. Nations will walk to your light, the prophets say, and the glory of Havai will be revealed, and all flesh will see together. And to go into the clefts of rocks and the folds of cliffs, due to the fear of Havai and the glory of his majesty. Meaning, the Jewish people are called the chosen people. This is actually one of the deeper ideas, is that by us living the Torah or bringing the Torah or introducing it into this world, we're actually bringing infinite light into the world and also fortifying an existence that can contain that revelation, which will be revealed when Mashiach comes. As we see in the high holiday prayers, shine out in the splendid majesty of your strength over all those who dwelt on planet Earth. Meaning we're davening by the holidays for Mashiach to come, that God should be revealed, that we'll exist. It's not like, oh, we're going to poof, disappear. We'll exist. Life will be, we'll have cars, we'll have Tesla, we'll have flying cars, whatever it will be. But we're also going to see how it's all part of God's, it's all coming from an infinite light. That is chapter 36. So in summation, let me just stop share. In summation, why did God create the world? Well, first of all, he created worlds, higher spiritual worlds and a lower world, this physical world. And it's actually, he didn't create the world. You might think he created the world for heaven or for the angel world. So no. Those were actually created just to get to, it was like a stage of getting to the lowest world where there's darkness, for the purpose of us making God's desire, God's wish, a dwelling place in the lowest realm, in the most dark, obscure place, bring light there. How do we do that? Through Torah, through not just through Torah, through in general, not giving into darkness, overcoming. It doesn't be like literally so religious. It could be the general sense of not giving into the obscurity of the dark God's hiddenness and searching for the light and trying hard to bring the light and bring connection points to a greater, to God, to feel close to God. That is light from darkness. Happens to be mitzvahs do it, in a sustainable way, and not just in a sustainable way, in a way that allows us to exist, even though we're bringing infinity into the world. And when Mashiach comes, there will be, all the flesh will exist, but we're going to perceive infinite light that is throughout the world in a revealed way. Okay. Any questions? It's not your average walk in the park. So is anything clear? Any questions? Anything resonate? No? Okay, I outdid myself then. I'm going to wish you all a good night. Next week, we're going to do chapter 37, part 1, the mechanics of how logically the mitzvahs do this. Like, how does it work? So I told you it works. Torah does it. Okay, you're taking my word for it, you're taking the Tanya's word for it. Next week, we're going to get very logical of the mechanism of how it works. It's very fascinating. So please join us next week, Thursday, 8 o'clock. Have a good Shabbos. Good to see you all. After Pesach, we're getting closer. We're doing the, let me just actually